I think a lot of people that live in Glastonbury can only really have the beliefs that they have because they're so isolated. Because it's just like one big echo chamber. And then as soon as anyone kind of steps out of that, it's just so easy to tear down the entire ideology. I mean, I think that was a lot of it for me. Was I started going to school and I started hanging out with kids that just were just like these normal kids that kind of grew up in town. I think a lot of the time I would just say things and people would be like, wait, why do you think that? I don't know. I've never really given it much thought, I guess. So I think to a certain extent, some of it was just trying to fit in. It's like, okay, everyone thinks I'm fucking crazy, so I need to figure out how to not act this way anymore. But I think it was so deeply entrenched that I had to completely renovate my entire belief system.
Welcome to Blinded by the Light, a podcast where we explore stories of spiritual trauma, PTSD, and healing from people raised in cut and other unusual religious circumstances. My name is Baird Lewis, and I was raised in Church Universal and Triumphant, the largest fringe religion to ever establish a presence in Montana.
I'm Justice, and my mission is to communicate with clarity and compassion about the hard, holy, and human. And to that end, I offer hypnotherapy sessions, healing, and I write most gratefully and graciously to express. And I grew up in the church as a kid, and I've moved my search for the truth into lots of different directions. So you can learn more about me at illuminationwithjustice.com.
Our guest today is Annie Newhouse, a young woman who is a child of 5 that grew up with a family heavily steeped in Church Universal and Triumphant. In part 1 of this interview, we're going to cover childhood and higher education, isolation in rural Montana, political ideologies of devout cut members, and how her experience parallels that of author Tara Westover, who wrote the book Educated.
Well, my name is Annie Newhouse. I did not join the church. I was raised into it. My parents joined when they were really young. They're both from the East Coast. They both kind of have different stories for why they came here. They were almost kind of opposites, where my mom was raised really strict Irish Catholic in Cleveland, and she became anorexic when she was about 14. And then when she was 19, she moved to Pasadena to live with this macrobiotic chef who claimed that he could heal her. She was just walking down the street one day and a woman saw her and I'm sure was like, well, she looks vulnerable. And invited her to a meeting. And that was pretty much it. She moved back to Cleveland and got all her stuff and then moved. I think she actually maybe moved straight to Montana because she joined right around the time when they were moving from Pasadena to Corwin Springs. So I think she joined when she was 19, and then my dad, I think, joined a little bit later. I think he was 22 or so. They're the same age, so he was a little after, but he, I think, just went to a meeting they had somewhere in Boston. And I think he just wanted some kind of structure because he was raised, his dad was a musician and his mom was just kind of a really severe alcoholic, and they were always just partying and there was just a lot going on. So I think he just wanted some kind of structure. And I think a lot of people just come here also just because it's so pretty. It's a really beautiful place. So I think that really drew him here too. And then he joined the fire department in the valley and became part of the land association. And there was a lot of need for construction work. So he helped build all of the shelters, and he built a lot of houses in the area in Glastonbury. So yeah, I think that they kind of came for almost different reasons. I think my mom was there was almost too much structure in her house. So I think going from like doing Catholic mass multiple times a week to just like eating brown rice and meditating was like actually kind of chill for her. Whereas my dad was like, I need more structure in my life.
And then what brought your dad to Montana? Because you told me a little bit about that on the phone.
I think he came for the church partly, but I think he just wanted to get out of the city because he was raised in a pretty poor suburb of Boston. He has a really big family and they're pretty overbearing and just all like in each other's business. And I think he just wanted to move somewhere that was like a smaller community. I think he probably just saw pictures and was like, this place is beautiful. And I think there was a lot more work here at the time because he's a welder and a construction worker.
And then where do you come in?
Well, my parents met through like a mutual friend who was also in the church. Like the creepiest person in the world. My dad was like, she's really cute. I'm going to ask her if I can pay her to clean my house. So that's basically what happened is she just started cleaning his house and then they started dating and they got married, I think like within a year, and then had my brother within a year of that, and then just had 5 kids.
Wow.
And we're all really close in age. Me and my older siblings are like 2 years apart and 2 years apart, and then the younger 2 are about the same. Which I don't know if that's a cut thing or if it's a Catholic thing or both, because I feel like cut families have really big families, but Catholics do too. Yeah, so they left the church I think when I was 7 or so, which I don't actually know why they left because they didn't leave after the shelter cycle. It still took them a long time. But my dad found this organization in New Hampshire called the Free State Project, which was basically just a ton of libertarians who are really into Ron Paul, and they were trying to organize to have New Hampshire secede from the rest of the country, which I think helped because I think he wanted to leave, but he didn't have a reason, so he found like a thing to get obsessed about. And then they just really quickly after that got really into politics. I don't even know if politics is the right word because I think it's a little more extreme than that. They got into like casual fascism and like prepper stuff.
You better TM that because casual fascism, that. You're going to see that in my next article. Yeah, Annie, what did your education look like as a child?
It was just very turbulent, I think, for all of us. My mom, she homeschooled us until I was, I think, maybe 6. So she homeschooled my older siblings for most of elementary school, and then I went to Arrowhead until I was in 3rd or 4th grade, and then we moved to New Hampshire. Just before the recession, I think I was in maybe 6th grade when they decided that all of the like lockdown drills that were becoming more commonplace were prepping children to be basically like taken out of schools and put into concentration camps. Sarah, did your parents not do this? Basically, my dad met this guy who was also super libertarian, and he was really like a super staunch, like fundamentalist Christian.
Okay.
So like we would go to their house on Sunday and his kids would like speak in tongues and stuff. And we were like, okay. Basically, my dad just started getting kind of into like the Old Testament and like Revelations. Both my parents did really. They just got really into like biblical prophecies. So they thought that there was like the mark of the beast was coming with like microchips. They thought that they were gonna like take us out of school and put us in a concentration camp and like put microchips in all of us so that they could track us. So they decided they were gonna homeschool us, which I don't know if they didn't really homeschool us, I guess, is the problem, is they were like, we're gonna homeschool you. And by that, we're gonna indoctrinate you with Alex Jones every day.
Wow.
So we didn't really get much of an education besides like
So you
prepping.
grew up with Alex Jones yelling in your ear.
Yeah. God, I think they started listening to him when I was like
Tell
10.
us about him a little bit, just for people who may not
sure.
be familiar.
How do you even describe Alex Jones? He is
Far
a
right?
very far right guy from Texas who basically turned conspiracy theories into his whole platform as a news broadcaster. So he, I think, just spends a lot of time on like 4chan, just weird internet like chat rooms and blogs and stuff, and then just takes all that information and just scares the shit out of everybody. And he's really aggressive. It's like he's either loud or louder, and he's super religious, super racist.
Looks like he's about to have a heart attack at any moment.
He's very red.
And his thing was InfoWars, correct?
Yeah. InfoWars. Yeah, and I think the thing with Alex Jones, too, that I didn't realize, I guess, until I was a little bit older, is that he's really good at taking all this information and then spinning it in this way to, like, scare the hell out of everybody, and then coming up with, like, a really good solution, which is always, like, and you will fix this by buying my protein powder, or buying these male hormone adjustment pills or whatever that can like boost your testosterone. So he's always got a solution for all of the like fear mongering. And it's always like the solution is buy this like vitamin B that you could buy for $12 at the grocery store, but it's $60 because it's made with special organic materials. So there's a lot of that kind of going on. But I mean, the guy made tons of money off of this. He had a lot of listeners. He still does. I mean, he advocated for Trump at the beginning of the election when he was still campaigning. But I would say anyone that doesn't know who Alex Jones is, just Google it.
Yeah.
Just Google Alex Jones gay frogs.
Which is a parody. Yeah.
He really said that, though.
Yes, I know.
He really said it.
Yeah, it's a thing.
I can put a link to that in the description of the show.
So
that was your education.
That was my education until I was probably 15 or so. I like begged my parents to let me go to high school. And we lived in the valley at that point. We moved back here from New Hampshire eventually because my parents were like, when the grid goes down and everything collapses, we don't want to be on the East Coast, so we're moving. It was kind of between like here and Idaho. And I think we all just collectively nagged my parents until they finally let us live here, because at least we knew people here. And coming from like, you know, a really small community where I had all these friends, and then moving to New Hampshire, and the town we lived in was very like just kind of uppity, and everybody was really rich, and we weren't, and there was 5 of us, so everyone thought it was weird that we had this like big family and we didn't have as much money as them. So I think it was like really hard for me to adjust initially, just moving back there, and then moving again. We were like, okay, at least let us move somewhere where we have like cousins.
Well, I mean, it sounds like a lot of isolation. So
yeah. So I think that I got to a point where I was like we live in the valley. I don't have any friends here anymore because when I was growing up in the valley, there was still so many church families who were still in the church, and they all had like these huge families. And so I had a lot of friends that lived really close by. And then once we had moved back, it was like all these kids I'd grown up with were all adults and had already kind of like left the community. So really all that was left was like ranchers and all of the like kind of older folks that were still living in GAV. So there really weren't a lot of kids there that I could hang out with. So I was like, I have to go to high school here or I'm going to lose my mind. So they finally let me go, but at that point, there were so many holes in my education. I was so far behind everybody else. Just keeping like C's and B's was so hard for me that I just like, I couldn't deal with it anymore. So I dropped out after a year of going to Park High, and then I moved out shortly after. But basically I worked for a guy who started a like survival packaging company that packaged like food and survival gear and whatnot. So I was working there, which I don't feel like was probably great for my mental state going from, it was like I was running away from that and going to school, and then when I left school I was like right back in it. So eventually I just kind of left that job, and then I moved out and kind of just sort of just detached from all of it. Even though my parents weren't really in the church anymore, I mean, my mom rejoined for about a year when we moved back. If you don't leave Glastonbury, you never really leave the church. You know, it's such a big part of the community out there. I mean, when my mom rejoined, my sister went to Thomas More, and my sister was like just full emo as a teenager. So she was like, are you fucking kidding me? They were like, you're not allowed to wear black. And she's like, I don't own anything that's not black. So
Bridging the gap between high school and what you're doing now.
It's been hard going back to school because there's still a lot of gaps in my education.
I'm curious how you even got credits to get into high school.
I didn't.
Okay.
They wanted to hold me back because there was so many gaps, and I kind of just, I don't really know how I convinced them, but they made me take a couple of freshman classes still because I didn't have any credits, and then I just got my GED when I dropped out, so I didn't really need them for college or anything. I barely got into college. I was like, I think I just got like the lowest score possible that they would accept because I had to retake the ACTs before going to MSU, and I did so bad, but it's not a hard school to get into. But I haven't taken any math classes yet. I have to take like a junior high school level math class, and I haven't taken math in a really long time, so we'll see how that goes. But fortunately, I've always really been like a big reader. So throughout all of that, I think that I used reading as a way to escape from all of the like insanity going on around me, partly because I think I could read books about people that were just having normal life problems, and that was almost my introduction to like the normal world. But I think I also just was able to keep up like some education through just reading all the time.
How did your parents react when they found out that you were trying to get a college degree?
Not well. I didn't really tell them. I mean, my sister told them. My mom just kind of started laughing and was like, oh. To be fair, I think some of it is not necessarily even their belief system, but I think there's like a blue collar pride where anyone that steps outside of that and gets like a college education, it's like, what, do you think you're better than all of us? So there's definitely some of that where my whole family kind of thinks that I'm just like a stick in the mud and I'm like too good for a like regular job, like a working class job. So I think there's some of that where I think they feel threatened by it because I'm the first person in my family to ever go to college. But I think that there is an element of, I think my parents both just think that college is like a liberal hub for brainwashing people into becoming communists. But I was a communist before I went to college, so joke's on them, I guess.
How have you handled the political ideologies of your parents?
I haven't had a relationship with either of my parents in 6 or 7 years. It took a long time, I think, to really reconcile all of it. I don't think I even recognized a lot of it until I was in my early 20s, because I think after I moved out, it was like just a lot of drinking and kind of trying to numb myself for years, and then finally being able to like come to a place where I could just start processing any of it. It took a long time. So I think I'm still kind of reconciling a lot of it, but I started kind of getting into politics when I was maybe 17 or so, because I had a friend who was just really liberal and just really feisty, and she was constantly challenging all of these beliefs that I had. And so I think just that mixed with kind of the distance from all of that, I think there reached a point where I kind of just stopped being able to even recognize like why I ever believed in any of it, because I think to a certain point it was, I think a lot of people that live in Glastonbury can only really have the beliefs that they have because they're so isolated, because it's just like one big echo chamber. And then as soon as anyone kind of steps out of that, it's just so easy to tear down the entire ideology.
I love the analogy that the echo chamber, like.
I mean, I think that was a lot of it for me, was I started going to school and I started hanging out with kids that just were just like these normal kids that kind of grew up in town. I think a lot of the time I would just say things and people would be like, wait, why do you think that? I don't know. I've never really given it much thought, I guess. So I think to a certain extent, some of it was just trying to fit in.
Yes.
Like, okay, everyone thinks I'm fucking crazy, so I need to figure out how to not act this way anymore. But I think it was so deeply entrenched that I had to completely renovate my entire belief system. Now, I mean, my parents, I think it's hard too, because we still live in Montana, like we still live in a red state. So I think now, because that kind of ideology is becoming more mainstream, my parents don't even have to be isolated anymore for people to agree with their political stances. They can pretty much just talk to any rancher in the valley and they can get the same kind of information. So it is weird spending so much time trying to unlearn that belief system and getting to a place where I'm like, okay, that was not normal. And now all of a sudden everyone's like, no, it's becoming normal. Like, well, shit. But yeah, I think for me, I think a lot of it probably was just being queer and then having to like reconcile with all of my parents, like just blatant homophobia and transphobia. Because they were always, I mean, I think a lot of just normal, regular Christians do this, where they'll like say like, oh, I'm not homophobic, I just don't agree with the lifestyle, or it's not really a problem, it's like a slippery slope. So if we let gays be gay, then suddenly like we have to let in pedophiles and bestiality is normal.
Right. Because let's draw like the conclusion, like, yes, there's a direct line of like having this kind of lifestyle that leads to completely like destroying other people's innocence. Like,
yeah, I think a lot of the problem is just like a complete lack of understanding consent, where it's like, so the difference is sexual assault. That's the difference, which I don't think that's exclusive to church members. I think that's just
No.
a societal problem we have.
Mm.
But I think there was a lot of homophobia in the church too,
Yes.
or transphobia too. I mean, there is just everywhere. But I mean, I remember thinking like, well, I could never date a girl because she could never be my twin flame.
Oh.
Because twin flames are male and female.
Oh, yeah. Wow, I never even considered that.
How long did it take before you felt like you could fully express yourself?
It took a long time. I mean, it's only been, I think, the last couple years that I've really been comfortable with it. And I don't think I even was like out to myself until I was in my early 20s. I think I was just so dissociated for so much of my childhood. I can't even really pinpoint when I started to become aware of it. It was just so wrapped up in like a lot of shame and thinking that it was some kind of mental illness or some kind of weird fetish that I had. I don't know when I started to actually see it as like a legitimate sexuality.
Mm.
It was just a long process. I don't know that I ever just like, there was a day when I was like, okay, everything's fine now. Yeah, it definitely took, I mean, I don't think I even started identifying as queer until like maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, it's totally normal for that to happen. Justice has talked a little bit about kind of getting away from a belief system like that it's like detoxifying from an addiction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good analogy.
Because it changes the way you think about yourself, and it changes the way you think about other people, and maybe even changing the way you think about yourself is maybe the harder one. I think it depends on the person.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, I think that was the case for me because I think I was able to, like, I was defending queer people with, like, talking to my mom for a long time before I identified that way. Because one of my first cousins is gay, and my mom just she doesn't even talk to him. She doesn't really talk to a lot of her family, but she'll say, like, I'm not homophobic. I have a nephew who's gay and I love him. And I don't think she's spoken to him in years.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she doesn't even know him. But I went to stay with him and his boyfriend when my grandma was dying. She had dementia, so I had to fly back to Cleveland with her because she couldn't fly by herself. And then I stayed with him and his boyfriend for like a week. And I was so uncomfortable the first like couple days because I was just like waiting for them to start doing really gay things, whatever that really meant. And then they were just like, where do you want to go for breakfast? Do you want to go to the botanical gardens?
Brunch and botanical gardens. So gay.
Which turns out that was the gay shit the whole time.
Right.
And I think, yeah, it definitely took me like a while because as soon as I got back, my mom was like, so how was it? Like, were they okay? Like, she was like waiting for me to be like, they had leather whips in the kitchen. Like, it's like, yeah, no, it was totally normal. They're the most normal couple I think I've ever stayed with, actually. So I think that was like a big turning point. I think I was maybe 15 at the time. And now looking back, I'm like, my cousin was totally trying to like low-key like figure out what was going on with me to like try to help me. Like, he was like, do you want to watch, we watched the movie Saved. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Love that movie.
I haven't seen it.
Basically, it's about this girl who goes to a super Christian school and her boyfriend comes out as gay to her, so she has sex with him to try to make him not gay anymore. And then he gets taken to a conversion therapy camp and she's pregnant.
Oh, wow.
And so she has to like reconcile with all of it, and she ends up like realizing that like the like kindest person at the school is like her best friend's like little brother who they're always really mean to, and like this like goth Jewish girl who like everyone's super mean to. Yeah, it's just like a really cute story, but I feel like they were like, that's a good movie to watch with this like real religious 15-year-old girl. And they were like, let's watch this documentary on climate change. Like, they were just kind of like trying to nudge me a little bit.
Yeah, just bring a little bit of some different information
For sure.
into your world.
Yeah.
What did the church teachings allow your parents to reconcile with their spirituality? I mean, for example, like Elizabeth Clare Prophet was raised Catholic, and
Yeah.
she had a relationship with the Virgin Mary. And if
Yeah.
you look at the structure of CUT, it was kind of, it's structured very much like the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think there's a reason that a lot of ex-Catholics joined the church.
Yeah.
Because my mom was raised, she was really Catholic growing up. She was first generation Irish, so her dad was like very strict. Like, we're going to go to like Latin Mass multiple times a week. I think that just familiarity of like shame is a big part of it. But I think the church was really smart in the way that they, like, Mark and Elizabeth were able to structure it so that I think it was similar, where instead of like going to confession and feeling really horrible for these things that you did, instead you're decreeing and you're like kind of repenting in a different way. But I think that the church kind of, because I think Catholicism is a very like disempowering religion, where it kind of just, everybody just feels super disempowered all the time, and that's sort of the point, I think. And I think that the church gave people sort of tools to feel more empowered. Like, instead of just feeling guilty all the time, they were like, well, you can decree like against a specific entity, and you're like literally saving the world by doing this, by ridding it of this evil. Where I think Catholics, they're like, well, I guess we could just work like 60 hours a week.
Well, and then there's penance, there's,
Yeah.
confession and
For sure.
all of that, right? But you're right. Like, I never considered that the Church Universal did take a more proactive stance, even though it was through magical thinking to a large degree.
Absolutely. I think it gave them an outlet to kind of separate their feelings from themselves, because any kind of negative emotions they had was because you were being attacked by an entity or your chakras were misaligned. So instead of actually acknowledging those feelings or trying to work through them, they could just kind of like pray it away.
Right. We call that a spiritual bypass, folks.
That is great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a term. I didn't coin that term. I first heard it from Jeff Brown, but it comes down from another author as well. And I was listening to a podcast, Conspirituality, last night, and he was drawing comparisons between the spiritual bypass that happens within the QAnon cult.
That's so interesting.
That also tends to happen in these fundamentalist religions.
Yeah, there's also this idea, and I didn't coin this, I don't know who coined it, but New Age Fundamentalism. So it's this idea that you have these New Age concepts, but then wrapped around that is like, you can't smoke, you can't drink, you can't have premarital sex, you can't be gay. So all these restrictions to then propel you more rapidly towards ascension or on your spiritual path. And that if you do those things that cloud your chakras or make karma, then you're going to derail yourself from that path for a longer period of time, or you may not make it at all if you give somebody head or something.
Precisely, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes. I didn't want to go anyways. I'm good. I like it here.
Honestly, I think when you think about it that way, it's like, I get it, because life is very difficult, and it would be so nice if there was just this set of rules that you could follow to just make everything better.
The thing that I dislike the most about that I mentioned in our first podcast is that it sort of it establishes this identity that your spiritual identity is fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And that you really have to work to maintain it and sustain it, and that it can be derailed so very easily. It keeps you on edge, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a sort of insidious way of forming a trauma bond with whichever religion it is that's perpetuating this notion.
I work at Haven, which is the domestic violence shelter in Bozeman, and I am constantly talking about this to my coworkers, but just how cults just use abuse tactics.
Yes.
And so do pretty much all religions.
Yes.
It's like you are worshiping an abuser.
Yes.
And there's an entire structure of beliefs behind it to gaslight you into just believing all of it.
So well said.
And if you ever step outside of it, then you're the bad person and you're not faithful enough.
Well, and as women, we're witches. I represent that remark with pride.
Absolutely. I think that is a lot of the reason why there is, you were asking, why is there such a lack of boundaries in the church? And it's such a toxic system because it's the leader is the ultimate gaslighter.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just teaching everybody underneath them to just gaslight each other. It's an entire community that's just gaslighting anybody that doesn't conform to all of the rules. And they did it to their kids. I mean, it's not like they just use those tactics in teaching us to believe in the teachings. It was everything. So I think it makes sense that as soon as anyone leaves and gets a breath of fresh air, they're like, oh shit, okay, this only works if nobody leaves and everyone is completely isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Because as soon as somebody comes in and is what the hell's going on here? This is a cult. Everyone's oh, well, they're part of Satan's cult, and
right,
they're trying to act for the fallen ones and come and bring darkness to our whole community.
And the mentality is very much I have a history with drug abuse, and it is you very much create your own little community and mindset and sort of reality subset.
Absolutely.
And then when somebody comes in and says hey, you don't look so good, and you're unhealthy, and you're toxic, and you're doing some really questionable things with your life right now, you're like, why are you judging me?
Yeah, why are you attacking me?
Why are you attacking me? Totally. It is so similar.
Absolutely. I think that structure too it's so brilliant because it's anybody that's hey, I'm concerned about you, it's oh, they're being influenced by the fallen ones.
Right.
Which is such a good excuse. It works for anything.
And I want to go back to your education and just kind of your childhood and talk about how you read the book Educated by Tara Westover. Yeah. Can you talk about how your experiences parallel hers?
Yeah. I read that book right before I started school because my therapist was you keep telling me things and I keep thinking that I either heard it from you or I read it in this book, but I can never remember. It's so similar. And then when I went to MSU the first year, I had to read that book in one of my classes. And then Tara Westover did the speech the first week. I don't remember what you call that. The
convocation.
Yeah, she did the convocation speech. I feel like there's just so many parallels. I think the main ones are probably the isolation, the mistrust of medicine, Western medicine, I'm really just so grateful that none of us died at a young age, because there was times when, like, my little brother got a fever, like a really high fever for like 3 or 4 days. It was like 106. And my mom was like, I've been putting him in cold baths and like rubbing essential oils on his feet, and like, I don't know what to do. And my aunt was like, you take him to the fucking doctor. And she finally brought him, and they were like, if we ever see you here again, we're calling CPS. Like, it was so irresponsible. And that kind of thing happened a lot. Like, I broke one of my toes because the same little brother dropped like a 40-pound weight on my toe and just smashed it. And my parents were like, you're fine, just walk it off. Like, it'll feel better in a couple days. And my toenail fell off. And it was just for like probably 3 months. I was just constantly in pain when I was walking. I like borrowed a pair of my brother's crutches just because I was like, no one's helping me. And then they were like, you're just trying to get attention and using these crutches. And it just, there was a lot of stuff like that where I think I started to almost think that anytime I got hurt or sick, it was like my fault. And I was just making a big deal out of it. I've still never been to the dentist. Besides a woman that my mom took me to when I was a kid, who practiced without a license, who basically just like prayed over my mouth and then was like, you're fine. And then my little brother fell into a fire when he was 3 at Mallard's Rest down in the valley. And instead of just bringing him to the hospital, they drove all the way back to our house in Glastonbury and put silver gel all over him. And then finally we're like, okay, we have to take him to the hospital. Like, they probably wasted like 2 hours. And he had 3rd-degree burns.
Wow.
My brother got gangrene in one of his teeth, which almost killed him. And my sister got like a root canal, and then they didn't get it crowned, so it cracked later. Just a lot of really irresponsible medical practices. But they were always kind of like solving things just with like silver water or echinacea tea or whatever. They were really into homeopathics. And none of us were vaccinated, because of course we weren't. So now I have HPV, which could have been prevented with the vaccine. So now I have to get like cancer screenings once a year, which is irritating. And I think the other thing that was very similar with that book, I feel like there's a lot of abuse that was really normalized in the church, like between kids, where a lot of the boys were just like horrible and no one really did anything about it. Like, everyone was kind of just left to their own devices. And I just remember, I feel like just like sexual abuse between like older boys and like young kids was just really normalized.
Wow.
Just all the time.
Wow.
And I remember hearing stories like that and just being like, I guess that's just something that happens. I don't know. But I think a lot of parents, they were just like either so checked out or they just couldn't deal with it.
Yeah.
That it just happened all the time, or people just didn't talk to their parents about it because they knew that nothing would really happen.
How long,
That's intense.
kind of tying into this, how old were you when you started seeking out regular medical care for yourself?
It was probably when I got Medicaid. I think before that I was still, I mean, I think I would have liked to have gone, but I couldn't afford it. Or I just didn't think that I needed to because there wasn't anything super obvious going on. But I think when I was like 21, 22, I finally got insurance and I just went and was like, just coming to just see what's up because I've never been at the doctor. And they were like, okay, here's a list of things that are wrong. So just the last couple years, I've pretty much been, like right now I'm going to physical therapy because my knees are really messed up. My feet, I have flat feet from just not wearing shoes as a kid. And then I have bunions because when I did wear shoes, my parents didn't buy us new shoes often enough. So I would wear shoes that were too small for me. And then I just have like a lot of back problems. So I've been going to physical therapy and then just getting updated on vaccines and...
What's your relationship like with the medical community? Do you feel like you have any residual paranoia from what you were brought up in?
I did. I spent a lot of time just really looking into the reasons behind like why people think vaccines cause autism and trying to just find like a shred of concrete evidence to support it, and I just couldn't find any. And then I started listening to a podcast that was on just like kind of medical malpractice and like medical conspiracy theories, and I listened to one that was about homeopathy and how there was a study that was done testing a bunch of different homeopathics and they couldn't even find like trace amounts of the like active ingredient. So I think now I've almost kind of gone in the opposite direction, and some of that could just be because I'm a science major, so I really like value the scientific method. So anytime there's something that I feel like I'm skeptical about, I'm like, what are scientists actually saying about this? Not like what's my friend's uncle Jeff saying on Facebook. So I think now I generally err on the side of trusting doctors more than distrusting doctors. Yeah, and I think it took me a long time to get to that point, though. And I think it's hard because still around here, that is kind of a normal thing for people to believe in, that like doctors are just trying to scam everybody and give them like their like poison pills, which I think that there is some truth to, like, you know, sometimes there are prescription medications that are kind of approved by the CDC maybe before they've been tested to the extent they should be.
Oh, absolutely.
But I don't think that that means that we should just discredit medicine. I think that's more of an issue with capitalism.
Absolutely.
So I think it's hard sometimes to talk to people about that, where it's like, I see what you're saying, but I don't have the same stance for the same reason. It's not because I just think there's some kind of like shadow government that's giving people these pills that are making them stupid or whatever.
I think as a society we have kind of developed an over reliance on artificial intelligence in general. And I would group pharmaceuticals in with that, as opposed to just taking better nutritional care of yourself. I mean, I think that there are definitely time and place for pharmaceuticals, like with there's a reason that these sciences have been developed, and at the same time I think there is definitely an over-reliance of the mentality that people want pills to fix them rather than to take accountability for their own health and well-being. And I think that that's a fine line, because you can go too far in that direction where you think you can fix yourself with everything that's going on. Like it sounds like from the environment that you grew up in was just rife with neglect. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that is, I mean, and I think it's hard because I do still think it comes down to capitalism, and a lot of times that is a class issue, and I think that a lot of the time people are blamed for their health problems because they don't take good enough care of themselves, but buying, like, you know, fresh produce is a lot more expensive than buying, like, processed foods, and especially I think for poorer families, not everybody can afford to take care of themselves, or, you know, like telling like a single mom, like, you should make like a healthy fresh meal for your 3 kids every night. It's just like, it's not really,
it's not realistic from
yeah.
where they're at. Yeah,
absolutely.
I get that.
So I think that, like, preventative care is like a class privilege. And I think that is still, it just comes down to like a capitalism problem where if it's not if it's not accessible to everybody, it's not really useful information, you know? Or it's useful information, but it's not really being applied the way that it needs to be. So I get it that it's, you know, not everybody has access to like the right nutrition to prevent them from becoming diabetic. And then once they get there, like, of course they need it. Like
They're trapped in
penicillin.
the
Like, of
system,
course they do.
right. Well, and insulin, and then they rake people on that too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, insulin, not penicillin. They need penicillin. Jesus.
Yeah, with the nutrition thing, there's been some research done in the Native American communities, even within Montana, that it changes your brain development, especially within a certain age, if you don't get proper nutrition. And a lot of those kids are living in a food desert. Like, they might go get junk food at the gas station, but like good produce, like real food that's not heavily processed, is pretty hard to get there.
Absolutely.
So I feel for those people, because even if they wanted it, they'd probably have to drive like 50 miles or 60 miles to get really good food.
And I think the food desert thing, I think it was like 40% of the U.S. population is living in a food desert. Because you take all the people who are living in inner cities, and you take the people who are living like way out on the edges, out on the boonies, and they're in the same circumstance. They don't have access to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is, it's a class problem, it's a race problem. And I think, I feel frustrated sometimes when people talk about preventative care, or even people, like, I think a lot of people are just, they just discriminate against people that obviously have health problems, because it's like, you did this to yourself, you deserve it, without taking into account that it's like, you could also be in this situation, but you've had the resources to not be.
That's valid. And it's interesting because it kind of, that mentality just goes into what you were saying about like feeling responsible for like for being sick, for being unwell, right? It's funny how like those kind of sort of gaslighty attitudes really kind of cross-pollinate between these different cultural groups. I think it's just a very common tactic. People need to be able to recognize it and be aware of it and be like, oh, actually, that's not my problem, and you're being a dick.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it justifies not having to provide health care for poor people. If it's your fault, then we shouldn't have to clean up your mess. Even though you live in a low income area, so you probably don't even have an education to tell you that you should have access to preventative care like good nutrition, but it's still somehow your fault. I think it makes sense that my ex-Catholic parents are that way. because it is very much, it's like, if this is happening to you, it's on you, and you should figure out a way to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
You've reached the end of part 1. Tune into part 2 of our interview with Annie to hear about some of the weird issues that surround food choices, exploring boundary issues with cut parents, why it's hard to leave a religion, why religious people get sucked into QAnon, narcissistic parents, how people heal from spiritual trauma, and more. If you enjoyed this podcast, the best thing you can do to support us is telling your friends and family. Building a community around these topics matters, because having our voices heard can mean greater healing and insights into our collective experiences. Subscribe to Blinded by the Light in your favorite podcast app, or subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest episodes. If you'd like to be on the show or want to send us stories for consideration, email the show at blindedpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.